here tonight to introduce Chuck Mahaleris, who has lived in Augusta for the last 25 years. Before that, a short time in Winthrop on Maranacook Lake in an apartment. He's married and has 3 grown children. And tonight he is going to talk on documenting genealogy and how to do your family's history. So please welcome Chuck.
Thank you. Appreciate you're all being here tonight. I'm very nervous, I will admit. I haven't really talked to groups that don't wear scout shorts in a long time. I've spent the last 50 years in the scouting program, and the reason I'm here is because Ricky took my genealogy merit badge class during the most recent merit badge college that we had over in Augusta. And so I like to teach genealogy to the scouts because I think it's important for them to understand that they're not the first ones here on the planet. It didn't all start and end with them. There are others that came through ahead of them and had the same kind of challenges, same issues that they're facing now, and somehow they all managed to get through it, and so can they. My mom, I don't know in your families who the keeper of family history is, but every family seems to have somebody who does the keeper of record. My mom is the keeper of record in my family. She's 84 this coming August. And when I was a kid, she would take us to cemeteries and old churches, and I could care less when I was a kid. She was very big into it, though. This is back before computers and internet and whatnot. It was hard scrabble tracing and slow, painstaking process to find a relative. And every now and then she would stop at every single cemetery she could come to. And she made a eureka discovery in a cemetery that was nowhere near where a relative lived. And she said, "That's where he is. That's where he is. How did he get here? I don't know, but there he is right there. He's here." Okay. She's very excited. And I can appreciate that. Nowadays, it's a lot easier. Because of online research and a lot of things have been scanned and uploaded to the internet, it's a lot easier now to try to track back the movements of your relatives from place to place, year to year. And so I've been able to make a lot of discoveries for my family. My mother was very good at putting in the important dates, the birth, the marriage, the death, those kind of things on her handwritten charts. And yes, I can fill in a lot of that now. More on my French side in Canada than my Greek side in Greece. The records in Greece are just horrible. First, they got invaded by Italy and Germany and whatnot, and they were conquered by the Turks before that. So record keeping was not high on their priority list. Surviving was. And of the records they do have, they didn't keep track of the women because it wasn't important at the time. I don't know why they thought that, but they did. So record keeping there was abysmal. And to be able to look at records in Greece, you had to be a priest. So my cousin Andrew, my father's cousin Andrew, he can go over to Greece and look at all the records he wants and then report back to me. But Canada, for those, how many of you have relatives from Canada? God bless the French priests. I mean, they kept track of everything. Sometimes their penmanship was not so good, but they kept track of everything. It's because of record keeping like that we have so many records from places like Acadia where they had the British forced them off their land and out of their houses, but they kept some of those church records. They thought they were that valuable, and they brought them with them when they were forced out. So my interest in family history got started a little bit when my grandfather died in 1993, not a lot, but more when my dad passed almost 10 years ago now. And it dawned on me, like, I'm getting older, there's more gray hair and on this young person's head than I remember when I was a kid. And B, with my dad passing, I was not able to get access to his stories, his firsthand accounts. And so it's like, okay, we got to do something about keeping track of all these stories. And so I started a labor of love. And this is what I've got so far. And this is the French side. There's a smaller one for the Greek side, but this is the French side. And I'm not going to read all of it to you, but I will share some of it with you tonight. I've also brought with me a copy of this book. This is the Camping with the Spirit of Adventure. It's the development of the Boy Scout camps for youth in northeastern Massachusetts. And the reason I brought that is because I was one of the researchers and writers of this book. It tracks the history of Scout camps from Boston area up to the New Hampshire border. And it was a lot of fun to research it. There was a lot more camps than even I knew about, and there were many. But it was a good tool for me to get used to the idea of doing research. So I'm going to need help with this presentation because, doing your family history, at least to me, is an important thing. I look at it like I'm here for a short window of time. And the ancestors who came before me deserve to have their stories told and shared with their descendants. And it's my job to do as much as I can so that my kids and my cousins and other people who I twist their arm to pay attention, look at these things and know that these were real people and had real lives and went through real challenges. So I want to get some help here. I want to introduce you to someone. And this is Armand Gauthier, or as the French would say, Gauthier. And Armand Gauthier was born on July 4th, 1907 in Lowell, Massachusetts. And I'll pass that around. Feel free to take a look at that. Armand was my grandfather, my Pepe. And great guy. He loved horseshoes, playing horseshoes. He loved smoking his pipe and cigar. He loved to tease anybody who was around, usually us grandkids, sometimes his wife, if he could get away with it. He spent many years working, putting in linoleum and carpeting in Lowell. So he learned several languages, enough so that he could talk to all the different ethnic groups in the city of Lowell. And he was very proud of where he'd come from. And his story is a very interesting one. And I'm going to share it with you in waves. And I guess growing up, you hear stories from relatives. I don't know if you have any tissues, Linda. Do you?
Right over there. Right there.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. You hear stories growing up, and you'd pay attention a little bit to them, but you have other things as a kid that you don't really pay attention to. So it goes in, it might cogitate in there a little bit, and most of it slides out, but you hear it enough times that it sticks with you. So I had heard stories about my grandfather being involved in some way with Jack Kerouac. Jack Kerouac came from Lowell, so a lot of people had a connection to Jack Kerouac. He was in the same neighborhood after all. And Jack liked to drink, so a lot of people remember Jack hanging out at the Old Worthen, and some remember Jack getting into trouble at the Old Worthen. But, you don't know how much of it's true. So in 1993, my Pepe passed from glioblastoma. He was 93 years old. And I wrote a little blog post on the internet about him. And then I got an email. Email came and it was from one of Jack Kerouac's biographers. And he told me the story about how he had interviewed my grandfather and included in his book that he wrote about Jack Kerouac. And I said, wow, well, that's pretty significant. And so I went looking around to see what I could find. And the first thing I found was the National Park Service in Lowell had a photo of the Kerouac family. And so there's young Jack, Tijan, as he was called. That's his sister, his mom, and that's dad, Leo. And that's my grandfather, Pepe Armengol, with the family. Pass that around. So that was the beginning of trying to collect the oral histories. I found out that, yes, that was a factual story, that he did know the Kerouac family, but how much of it, how well did he know? I mean, were they in the same neighborhood and whatnot? So I decided that, and I learned some skills early on in this process. Excuse me, apologize. Just a little bit of allergies. The first thing with family history is find your relatives and get them talking. Get them talking. I wish I could go back in time and talk to Pepe, get some of those stories right from his mouth again, or from his wife to hear her point of view about everything, because she would have a different angle on it than he would. But get them talking, keep them talking. They don't want to talk about things unless they want to talk about it, and then they'll talk about it. But if you can record it, videotape it, whatever they'll let you get away with, keep trying to do it. Let's see here. And so I have a little thing that I'll share with you now. And I think this was my first piece in that three-ring binder. If it wasn't the first, it was right up there early with the first. The title is like Mr. America, Armengol and Jack Kerouac. And this was after doing a little bit of research and finding out things. Yeah. Jack Kerouac is one of our nation's most famous authors, and certainly the most famous to come from Lowell, Massachusetts. He's perhaps the most famous author of the Beat generation, and his seminal work, On the Road, is studied in many college literary classes for its stream of consciousness style. An interesting sidebar. He had written some of On the Road on a rolled up wallpaper roll. So it was very interesting. Here's a quote from that autobiographical book. And as I sat there listening to that sound of the night, which Bob has come to represent for all of us, I thought of my friends from one end of the country to the other, and how they were really all in the same vast backyard, doing something so frantic and rushing about. Kerouac grew up in Lowell and had a trusted association with Armengol, father of Blanche Gothier Mahaleris, who was friends with Kerouac's father, Leo. So my mom is Blanche Gothier. That's why I included her in there. And just so you know, I write all of this with one person in mind, and it's Mom. Sorry, I get choked up. She was doing it for years back when it wasn't easier, so I look at it, she's my audience. I write this stuff. Let's see here. Leo, that was Jack's father, he had run a print shop in 1923 called L'Etoile on Prince Street, which he ran until 1938. One source I found said that my Pepe Armen worked at the print shop. Leo also ran the Pawtuckaville Social Club and let the neighborhood kids, including Jack, come in to play pool. The Pawtuckaville Social Club, for those of you who don't know, every French community had a little social club. It wasn't just a place where they hung out and drank. at the early stages, when they first came over to the United States, those social clubs were the gathering place where they had people who walked them through the immigration process and helped them get jobs in the mills and explained, the different things. And then eventually they started working together because of these social clubs to get some political power in their communities. Let's see here. Together, Leo and Armin opened a boxing and wrestling gym in 1930. My grandfather was extremely strong. I have a photo of him where he could lift up two guys on his arms right here, and he lifted them up off the ground. They were sitting there on his arms. He pulled himself up on a house just with his fingers and hung there for a while. He was very strong. So Leo decided, well, you're and I don't know if any of you are familiar with Leo. He was into boxing and wrestling, and so he got my grandfather to be one of his wrestlers and boxers during the Depression. Excuse me. Kerouac biographer Dennis McNally interviewed Pepe for his book, Desolate Angel, Jack Kerouac and the Beat Generation in America. Here's an excerpt from that book. Lowell had its virtues, but the city, even if he were to remain a townsman all his life, the city was part of his future. Once or twice, the Kerouacs even journeyed to New York, visiting Gabrielle's stepmother in Brooklyn. Despite the Depression, they were pretty well off. Leo, who acquired a driver's license later that year of 1932, was able to buy his first car, a 1928 Model A Ford, and then hire a local man, Armin Gauthier, as his driver. And the reason he hired Armin Gauthier as his driver was because Leo was too short to reach the pedals. The Kerouacs moved, and during the Depression, I don't know if you've heard stories of your relatives during the Depression. Any job you could take, you took. So my grandfather he worked at a furniture place in Lowell, and then in the Depression, unfortunately, his job was to collect the furniture because people were paying in installments and they couldn't keep up with the payments, so he'd go do that. Eventually, that ended, and he and Leo did more work together, and he did upholstery on the side. Anything that you could do to make a buck, they did it. Let's see here. The Kerouacs moved around the city a bit. One of their moves brought them into the Gauthier neighborhood of Pawtucketville, when they moved first to Phoebe Ave and later to Sarah Ave. And Sarah Ave was where my grandfather grew up, and he later bought a house on Phoebe Ave. Another Kerouac biographer also mentions Pepe. In the book Subterranean Kerouac, The Hidden Life of Jack Kerouac by Ellis Ambrum writes, Tijan, which is Jack's nickname, was about 9 years old, became infatuated with one of Leo's wrestlers, Armin Gauthier. And when Leo invited Armin home for supper, Tijan beseeched him to show us his muscles. Nin, Jack's sister, who was 10 years old, would hang from one bicep, and I would hang from the other, Jack wrote. What a build, like Mr. America. And still another writer describes Pepe as being Jack's hero. Quote, Jack became an introvert until his father befriended one of the print shop workers, Armin Gauthier, who turned into Jack's hero because he was a professional wrestler. He was Jack's first guide into areas beyond the ken of Gerard, and was still a French-speaking Catholic who helped maintain Jack's French-Canadianness as he prevented the future novelist from interacting with outsiders instead. I think one of the things he's referencing to is that my grandfather would go into some of the bars to get Jack out of trouble when Jack, had a few too many. August of 2014, I received a very nice note from Kerouac biographer Paul Marr, Jr. Below is the email. Many thanks to Paul for reaching out and sharing some wonderful observations about Pepe. I read your blog on Armin and enjoyed it. I'm a biographer of Kerouac, and just wanted to alert you to another reference of Mr. Gauthier in Kerouac's short story In the Ring, where Armin is called Roland Botellier. who was my father's unofficial chauffeur because my father couldn't drive his 1929 Ford himself, his legs being too short, or him having to walk too much while driving. And Roland, also a young friend of the family's, about 22, and a worker in his printing plant to boot. The whole piece seems to be about Armand. It can be found anthologized in the Kerouac book, Good Blonde and Others. So that was one of my early pieces about my relatives. But when you start talking about family, you soon find that just talking about one is going to lead you to others. You know, Armand didn't live alone in a bubble. He had parents. So this is Arthur Gauthier, my great-grandfather, and Lydia Rowe, my great-grandmother.
R-O-E-W-E?
R-H-E-A-U-L-T.
Oh,
Yeah, that's French. That's French.
And spelled other ways as well that I found. R-E-A-U-X, R-E-A-U, et cetera, et cetera. So now I'm going to go into some of the ways that I find this stuff out. I use Ancestry a lot. I like Ancestry. Others use Family Search. I'm sure that's fine too. The reason I don't use Family Search is because they're very similar in what they do. You set up a family tree and you start building on your family tree. I don't want to have more than one family tree. I don't want to be using more than one program. So I use Ancestry. That's because I started with Ancestry. And it seems, it gets clunky at times, but, you know, they seem to work through it, and it seems to be large enough that they, you know, work through their problems. I also have a subscription to Quebec Genealogy. I like that one because it gives me good basic data about who, what, and where. And then I can use that as a starting point to build off of it. I find it's easier to track children off of my ancestors using the Quebec Genealogy first, and then I can go into Ancestry and track those kids down deeper. Yeah.
When did the Quebec thing, when did they get together? Because I come from Canada, and when I first left Canada, all our birth records were at the church.
Right.
They weren't into Quebec yet.
Yeah, they've been adding. You're probably familiar with Tangway records and whatnot, and the Tangway were the early ones for the tracking the Quebec records, and they were very good. But now that there's so much of the records all online, all the church records are online now, and they're not just, you know, with Ancestry or Family Search or some of these other ones. You can probably find them with the Library of Quebec. To be able to pull them off there. It's just easier to search them through some of these other groups that I find. As to when, I couldn't tell you. I've been doing it for about 10 years now, and I've been using Ancestry for that long, and it works for me. They're adding more as they go. You know, the French relatives were always easier just because they had such good records, but they're adding more and more. So the longer you're in it, the more records you get. And I'll come back to some of that stuff in a little bit. One thing, though, I've got to caution you. Too many people I see using Ancestry, and they just see somebody else has a same relative in a family tree, and they just grab their family tree and they put it all over there and use it as their own, without checking first the data that they've done or how much work they've done or whatnot. I can't tell you how many rabbit holes I've gone down because somebody else didn't do the work and I thought it looked good at first and it wasn't. So I'm very meticulous now about first make sure that what I see is true, and then I go from there. And then if I hit a wall, then I'll start looking to see what other people have and see if what they have is true before I put it in my tree. But I try not to just grab somebody's tree and put it in my tree because I'd rather look and find and see if it's right before I use it. Some other things that I use. I found two search engines for newspapers that I like. One is called Newspapers Online, and one is Newspapers Archives Online. And they both do the same thing, but the reason I use both is because a good chunk of my relatives come from Lowell, and Newspaper Archives has much more of the Lowell Sun in their collection than Newspapers Online does. Newspapers Online is tied to Ancestry. I don't know if it's owned by Ancestry, but it's tied to them. And you can get a part of your newspaper online if you're an Ancestry subscriber, or you can pay a little bit more and get all of it. I paid a little bit more and I get all of it. It's just worth it, just so I don't have to get aggravated by it. And Newspaper Archive, I've just found their collection of especially Lowell stuff was great. Lowell Sun. And not all newspapers are online yet. The Library of Congress is spending money to get more and more newspapers digitized and collected and saved. And as that happens, we'll have access to more of that stuff. Like right now, I've got relatives from Franklin, New Hampshire. None of those newspapers are online right now. So I got to go to Franklin or Concord to check out the microfilm of the Franklin papers to check out those relatives. Same is true on my Greek side. The Peabody papers aren't online yet. So I got to go to Peabody if I want to see what happened with those relatives. But you do what you got to do. There's also BANQ. I'm not sure what it stands for, but it's the Quebec Museum archival stuff. You can go on there. They collect not only. It's kind of like the Library of Congress, I guess. They have photos. They have plot plans from the towns where your relatives came from. They have newspapers. They have all of the church records that I mentioned earlier. They have notarial listings. So for French relatives, not only did they get married, but before they got married, they went to see a notary. A couple of days before, they had to go to a notary and get their wedding notarized, and then they got married. So they have all those records, and I recommend that one. It's a good, easy one. BANQ. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about Lydia's story, and I'll pass this around too. So that's my great grandmother Lydia, and my great grandfather. So, October 3rd, 1904, Lydia Rowe becomes the bride of Arthur Gauthier. Miss Lydia Rowe and Mr. Arthur Gauthier were married yesterday morning at St. Joseph's Rectory, the Lowell Sun reported in a small notice in its October 4th, 1904 paper. The ceremony was being performed by Reverend Father Audilette, OMI. It'll come to me, get what that stands for. The bride wore a traveling gown of gray cloth. A wedding breakfast was served at the residence of the groom's father, Mr. Hercule Gauthier, 37 Sarah Ave, after which the young couple left on a short bridal tour. I like the interesting things. They didn't wear white back then. It was, or they wore what they had. The weddings seem to all have been morning ones on a Monday or other days, but it wasn't necessarily like a weekend thing. It was morning, and they didn't have a breakfast afterwards. Lydia Rowe was born in Quebec province in the town of Notre-Dame-de-Montcamal and baptized the 28th of March, 1885. The church record notes, however, that at the time of her baptism, her family were parishioners of Saint-Nigel-de-Laval, which is a town across the St. Lawrence River from Three Rivers. She was the daughter of Pierre and Delphine Duchamp Rowe. Her uncle, Eusebe Rowe, and his wife served as godparents. Lydia's mother passed in 1888 at the age of 40 when Lydia was just 3 years old. And I have yet to figure out exactly the details, but family history is that Delphine had gone a little crazy and had been put into an asylum. And I have yet to track that back, but that's the family story. Widower Pierre, whose trade was listed as a farmer in the 1881 census, married Adrienne Dupont in Montcalm within a year following Delphine's death. Arthur had been born on May 5th, 1886 in the town of Drummondville. His parents, Hercule and Elizabeth Teddo Gauthier, had grown up and worked in Montcalm, but moved to Drummondville by 1883 when the work at the forges began to cool. Arthur was baptized at St. Frederick Church. The Gauthiers moved to Lowell by 1894. Prior to the wedding, Lydia was living at 62 Hall Street in Lowell, and Arthur was living with his parents at 37 Sarah Ave. Neither had been married before, and the vital statistics records note that she was 19 and he was 18 at the time of the ceremony. Arthur's occupation was packer, and Lydia worked at the hosiery plant. Witnesses for the wedding were Arthur's father, Hercule, and Ludger Carignan. The Carignans were family friends who lived at the time at 42 Gershom Ave. After I wrote this, I discovered that there were Carrigan was also a relative. After the wedding, the couple moved to 547 Moody Street, where Lydia delivered their first child, Arthur, on November 10th, 1905. Arthur Sr. passed on September 23rd, 1912 from tuberculosis. He was 26 years old when he died. They had 8 years of marriage together and 4 children. Arthur, born in 1905. My grandfather, Armin, born in 1907. Claire, born in 1910, but who passed in 1911. Talk about her in a little bit. Jeanette Simone, who was born in 1911 and died just a few months before her father on May 5th, 1912. And while going through, my mother let me go through all of the photos because she kept all the family photos that she could get her hands on. And so for 2 years straight, I scanned all the photos and set them up and archived them and organized them so that I could have them for this project and also just to keep them easier. I have them all digitized on an external hard drive, set up by year and family and whatnot. Pass that one around.
It is.
So that's Arthur, born in 1905. And that's my Pepe, born in 1907 on the 4th of July. I like the outfits they wore back then. Put the kids in them. Let the hair grow long for them. So that brings us to family keepsakes. Photos, diaries, Bibles, treasured documents. Keep them. Don't. My mother says to me all the time when we talk about a certain line of our family, oh, she threw away all those pictures because she didn't know who they were. Like, what? So, I mean, I have a box of pictures that I got from on my Greek side that I have at home. And I don't know who most of them are. But I am sure that somewhere in there is my other great-grandfather, Costas Mahaleris, Costas Papafagis, who's in that box somewhere. I just don't know which one he is. So I'm not parting with that box for anything, even if I don't know who it is. At some point, I'll get to Lowell and I'll find some old Greek who can help me identify some of these pictures. But hold on to all those treasured items and treat them like museum pieces. Don't let anybody muck with them. I use my external storage device for photos. I prefer that than to even having the originals. I let my mom have all the originals. I know at some point I'll get them all back, but she can have them for now. And I make it a policy that I share all this information and all the photos. I share it all freely with everybody who wants it. I'd rather it get out to whoever and share it than it get lost.
Do you have a way to scan like really big photographs?
Well, I work for Senator Susan Collins and
So you have access to a big.
I have a large stand-up scanner. But sometimes when I first started this project, I was doing a lot of stuff at Staples. I would just go over there and use their equipment, and they do everything there. And that's where I printed up some of these story pieces. When I print these up, I share them with my siblings. Each get a copy. I have a 3-ring binder for each of my kids. My mom gets a copy, and some of her siblings still get a copy. So, like my Aunt Jean has one for her line. My Aunt Lorraine has one for her line. My cousin Tammy has one for her line. I think that's all of those lines. Yeah. But I do about 14 or 15 copies of each for the French side and about 10 for the Greek side. Yeah, feel free to ask questions at any time. I don't mind at all. Thank you. All right, so this one's a little bit longer. If you indulge me for a little bit here. I showed you the picture of my great-grandmother, Lydia Rowe. And through research and family stories, I was able to find out some of her tragic story. Arthur Gauthier was dead. The only son of Hercule and Elizabeth Teddo Gauthier had passed away in their Lowell home before dawn at 3:30 a.m. Monday, September 23rd, 1912. The husband of Lydia Rowe and father of 4 had finally lost his difficult battle with pulmonary tuberculosis. He lived a total of 26 years, 4 months, and 17 days. He had spent that time in physically challenging jobs. In the end, the disease had robbed him of his youth, his vitality, and ultimately his very last breath. A moderate rain had fell over New England that day, and I knew that because I looked at the newspaper. As Lydia filled out her husband's death certificate while awaiting the return of Dr. Roderick Mignol to sign and then file the document. And I know that because I saw the death certificate. Dr. Mignol, who worked for the City of Lowell's Board of Health out of his office at 534 Merrimack Street, and I know that from looking at directories and the city record, had been visiting Arthur regularly since August 27th. During the school year, Mignol inspected the schools, but was free during the summer to respond to cases such as Arthur's. On Sunday, he found Arthur to be only barely alive. Lydia, or someone else, also had to make arrangements with Amadi Ashambo, the undertaker, and his son served the community from their business at 738 Merrimack Street, and they would bring the body of the mill operative to his final resting place at St. Joseph Cemetery in Chelmsford on Wednesday, the 25th, where Lowell's French Canadians had been buried since 1894. And the reason that the French were buried in Chelmsford was because the Irish did not want them in their cemetery. So they had to set up their own cemetery in Chelmsford. Arthur and Lydia had been forced to give up their apartment and move in with Hercule and Elizabeth sometime in 1912 when his health deteriorated, preventing him from working. In 1910 and 1911, the city directory lists Arthur and Lydia as living at an apartment at 13 Pawtucket Street. They moved in with Arthur's family at least as early as May 4th, 1912. That was the day Dr. Mignol, who would later run for mayor of Lowell in 1917, had visited the family to check on Arthur and Lydia's 4th child, Simone. Measles ended Simone's life at 4 a.m. the following day. She was 4 months and 12 days old. Lydia's memory of her dealings with Dr. Mignol and Undertaker Ashambo when Simone passed was still fresh, and she had to repeat the same painful process for her husband just 5 months later. Hercule and Elizabeth had only moved into 24 Sarah Ave home in 1911. It was their first permanent home since leaving Canada in 1891. Arthur had been 5 at the time that they left Drummondville and grew up in Lowell. Their eldest daughter, Alice, had married Alphonse Lemire in 1897. I put way too much stuff in these early ones. I didn't know how to break up my stories. And so, like, some of these were much longer than they needed to be. I could have broken it up into other stories. So I apologize for that. But let's see here. Alice had married Alphonse Lemire in 1897, but the Gauthiers still had Diana, 28, Angelina, 23, Yvonne, 21, Jeanette, 16, and Loretta, 13, living with them when Arthur took ill in 1912. Soon, the 4-bedroom home had 11 occupants. It was so crowded that Lydia's sons, Arthur, 6, and Armand, 4, stayed in the closets for a short time that year. Diseases such as measles and tuberculosis seem rare today, but were all too common then. In 1912, Lowell officials reported 2,145 cases of diseases ranging from only 2 cases of smallpox to 873 cases of scarlet fever. I don't know where you stand on the whole COVID shot and whatnot. I took every shot I could get. After doing all this genealogy and seeing all my relatives dying and everything, I'll take it. Yeah, I'm willing to do it. The year before, there had been 148 cases and 149 in 1910. Scarlet fever swept through the city that year, but few died, only 6 from it. Conversely, Simone was one of 50 to die of measles, and Arthur was one of 151 to die from tuberculosis. Consistently, those who contracted tuberculosis were more likely to perish from it than other illnesses. In 1911, 159 Lowell residents died of TB. In 146 in 1910, 159 in 1909. TB deaths spiked in Lowell between 1900 and 1905. TB took 110,000 Americans each of those years. And those are all statistics that I got out of various books at the time, published at the time, tracking all these things. And, you know, it's kind of a sad thing to do, but our relatives went through so much that it'd be a shame not to talk about it. Consumption, as was called, and I can never pronounce this one, phthisis, scrofula, Pott's disease, and the White Plague are terms used to refer to TB in its 9,000-year history. Caused by a germ breathed into the lungs, active pulmonary TB can be passed from person to person through coughing, sneezing, or kissing. Symptoms of active TB include chest pains, coughing, blood, fever, chills, appetite loss, and fatigue. It was also called consumption because it seemed to literally consume people with a long period of suffering before death. Today, it's estimated that about 2 million people per year die worldwide from tuberculosis. The disease is countered with vaccines and antibiotics. No such remedy existed in 1912. Once you had the active form of TB, there was no telling how long you had. Death could occur 2 to 3 months after infection or years later. It was also often confused with pneumonia. Arthur was not the first in the family to fall from the disease. His aunt Amanda Gauthier, Hercule's sister, died from TB in 1894. The Gauthier's formal parlor was never casually used. It was where Arthur's body had been viewed and again after Arthur's sister Jeanette was struck down by TB in 1915, 5 days after her 19th birthday. And there's Jeanette. Lydia was the daughter of Pierre and Delphine Duchamp, as I mentioned earlier. She married on November 20th, 1870 in the town of Saint-Angel-de-la-Belle. Those two married in Saint-Angel-de-la-Belle. Now it's Becancour. Saint-Angel was a separate town back a decade or 2 decades ago. Quebec merged a lot of these little towns into major towns. So Saint-Angel-de-la-Belle is part of Becancour now. Located on the southern shore of the St. Lawrence across from 2 rivers. They moved north to Notre-Dame-de-Montcalm. Their first son, Pierre, was born in 1874, but would perish months later. Joseph was born in 1875, Henry in 1878, Victor in 1883, and the couple's final child together was Lydia in March 28th, 1885. Pierre married again in 1889 to Adrienne Dupont after Delphine died. Their son Henry went to Alaska to seek his fortune in the gold rush, never to be heard from again. And that's one of those family mysteries that continues to still elude me. My mother mentions Henry, and at some point I will continue to try to find him, but so far he has eluded me. In 1901, Lydia left the farm for Lowell, where the population was nearly 100,000, with 43% having been born in a foreign country. Hercule and Elizabeth, Arthur's parents, were married on November 23rd, 1874, in Notre Dame de Montcalm. There were less than 1,000 people living there at the time. So they went from a town of 1,000 to a town of over 100,000.
Yeah.
Culture shock. So it's likely that the Gothies and the Rows knew each other, especially given the attendance at the Catholic Mass was mandatory. So I'm sure that they saw each other when they went to the church. And a couple of years ago, what year was that, honey? We went to Montcalm?
No, it was just after they opened the border
Yeah.
from after COVID.
No, Montcalm was before COVID.
Was
Wasn't it? Yeah, it was like 4 or 5 years ago we went to Montcalm. We went to Montcalm, we went to Saint Angel de Laval, we went to all these places that I'm talking to you about just to see what it looked like, what the church looked like, to see, we visited the cemeteries. It was more interesting to me than my wife, I'm sure, but she's a good sport.
But in one of the churches that we visited, you actually found one of your relatives on the wall, a picture. Which
I did, yeah.
Really
in Montcalm, they had pictures of wedding pictures going back to the 40s and 50s, and one of them was my Pepe's cousin, Willie Rowe, and his wife. And that was kind of cool. I took a picture of that. It was nice. Let's see. Hercule and Elizabeth's first child, Alice, was born in 1875. After Hercule's father, Charles, died in 1876, the Gothies moved to Drummondville. Everybody moved up to Montcalm because there was a couple of foundries that opened up. There was Lislet and there was Radnor. Those were the two foundries that opened up. And when you're a dirt poor farmer, you found jobs that you could. And when those things opened up, they said, okay, we can continue to work the farm because we got many kids. They can continue to work the farm. And we can go work the foundry. Some did both. Like, I know that the Rows were able to keep their farm in Saint Angel because they would go up there. They'd live up in Montcalm, which was across the river and several towns up. And they'd work there. And then the foundry would shut down and they'd go back and they'd work the farm for part of the year. Let's see here. In 1900, there were 1,390 Franco-Americans in Pawtucketville, which is one small section of Lowell. Lowell has about 6 or 7 sections. Pawtucketville was the most recent one to be established, and it was established specifically because all the French Canadians coming down and they filled up Little Canada in the acre section, and they outgrew it. And then other groups came in, like the Greeks, and they needed the poor neighborhood. And so the French moved over to Pawtucketville and started their own neighborhood. Mayor Charles Howe describes 1903 in his report to the city. I found this in the, we do annual reports, and so they have all these things, and sometimes politicians like to say a lot. And so I was able to get a few quotes, and I'll go into, I won't give you all of the quotes and everything, but he talks about the year it was and whatnot. Let's see, he talked about the effects of the horrible calamity, both in human suffering and the destruction of property, are yet in evidence, and the care of the afflicted is still a public duty. He was referencing the explosion at the U.S. Cartridge Company and the American Powder Company. People as far away as Dedham to the south and New Hampshire towns to the north felt the shock. A total of 22 people were killed and 70 injured. Add to this that the city's water supply was found to have caused an epidemic of typhoid fever in 1903, 168 cases and 9 deaths in 2 months. 2 months. 1904 did not start off well either. Before January was even half over, Lowell had suffered 3 substantial fires, one of which claimed the largest department store. Before the year would end, just over 700 alarms were called into the Lowell Fire Department. 5 of those alarms included a fatality. The year's largest fires claimed Lowell's iconic Huntington Hall. The old City Hall, St. Patrick's Church, and even the Central Fire Station were nearly lost. So Lydia and Arthur were wedded at St. Joseph's Rectory, as I mentioned before. And I explained a little bit about that. Skipping a bit here. Prior to the marriage, they both lived within walking distance of several mills. And that was true of all these recent immigrants to Lowell. They lived within walking distance of the Tremont, Suffolk, Lawrence mills, and the Massachusetts manufacturing mill. Arthur lived with his family on the other side of the river at 37 Sarah Ave, and he would ride the trolley. They had set up a trolley system in Lowell. I mean, can you imagine in Montgomery, I guarantee they didn't have electricity, and here they had trolleys. Arthur worked as a molder in 1903 and a packer in 1904. A molder was somebody who worked in a foundry. They heated up metal to do whatever the plant needed to be made with metal. He did that job because his father, Hercule, had been a molder at various places in Drummondville and Montcalm. Had learned the trade from his fathers as well. He didn't like the job, and so he became a packer at the hosiery place. And that is where I think he met my great-grandmother, Lydia, was at the packing place. So their first child, Arthur, was born 1905. They were living on Moody Street, which is one of the big roads in Lowell, and lived there with their son, Armand, when Armand was born on July 4th, my grandfather. Arthur worked in the mills as an operative and later as a polisher. In 1908, the directory gives more details. The family still lived on Moody Street in room 32. Arthur's occupation was a laborer. They lived a couple blocks from St. Jean-Baptiste Church and a short walk to Arthur's parents, who lived at 121 Gersham Ave. Father Campineau and 4 sisters of charity purchased the Ayer Mansion at 357 Pawtucket Street. The nuns lived in Lowell on September 1st, 1908, and set to work transforming the chateau, as they called it, a big old Victorian building. It was on the corner of Mammoth Road, and it's next to the Merrimack River, and they turned it into an orphanage for the French-Canadian kids. And the reason I include that will become clear shortly. On October 15, 1908, the new Franco-American orphanage welcomed the first 16 children entrusted to their care. The growing French community in Pawtucketville established Saint Jean-Baptiste Parish, school, in 1910. The 2-classroom school on 4th Ave was staffed by the nuns and residents at St. Joseph Convent. It was a census year. On April 15th, a census worker visited Arthur and Lydia at their 13 Pawtucket Street apartment. And again, talk about what they were doing for work. Lydia, living in the household were Arthur, 24, Lydia, 25, Arthur, 4, Armand, 2, and Claire was just 2 months. She was their 3rd child, arriving on February 20th. Lowell was an oven that summer. It was said to be the hottest July residents had seen in 30 years. The city Poor Farm near the Chelmsford town line recorded a temperature of 98 degrees Fahrenheit. This is well before air conditioning, well before. The Lowell Fire Department helped keep people cool by wetting down the roads twice per day. The city air was unhealthful normally, and more so during hot spells. And if you can imagine all those mills turning up smoke all day long, and people were saying that was the sign of progress, and but what it was doing to people's lungs. Let's see here. The city air was unhealthful during normal times and more so when it got really hot. Those who were too poor to ride the electric train cars out of the city swarmed the banks of the Merrimack and the Concord rivers. In 3 days, 41 deaths were recorded in the Lowell area due to heat, with a full third of those being children under 5. This had to weigh on the young parents' minds. Sometime in 1911, while visiting relatives of Arthur's mother, Elizabeth, who lived near scenic Lac La Belle in Quebec province, baby Claire died. And so I didn't understand what they were doing in Lac La Belle. Lac La Belle is an hour north by car from Montreal, up in the Laurentian Mountains. So to get there from Lowell, you had to take a train and take several connections to get all the way to La Belle, where they had a depot there. They set up the depot in 1909. But I couldn't understand why they got there. Perhaps they made the long journey to escape another Lowell heat wave. On July 4th, Harmon's 4th birthday, the thermometer in Lowell passed 100 and hit 106 degrees in nearby Nashua. This heat wave would go on for 11 days and kill 380 between Pennsylvania and Maine. It was during this heat wave that hundreds slept on Boston Common. Cows stopped producing milk, and some people went crazy from the heat. Lac La Belle is 400 miles north of Lowell, in the mountains of the Laurentian region. Arthur took the family there by train from Lowell to Montreal and then to La Belle. There were 1,300 people living in the area when the Gothiers visited the Teddos. They went to visit his uncle, my great-grandfather's uncle, Joseph Teddo, brother of Elizabeth, his mother. They went there. In the small village. Little Claire was buried in La Belle, and the Gothiers returned to Lowell after her passing. 1911 ended on a happy note with the birth of their 4th child, Simone, on Saturday, December 23rd. The day had a mix of rain and snow, but clearing was expected on Sunday. She was their Christmas gift. You could buy whiskey for 49 cents per quart, butter 35 cents per pound, and a round-trip train ticket from Boston to Montreal was $11.45. 1912 was an extremely hard year. The Bread and Roses strike paralyzed both Lowell and Lawrence from January 1st to March, forcing 14,000 mill workers out of jobs. Simone died from measles on May 5th, and TB claimed Arthur September 23rd. So I think that he went up to La Belle because he had the long tuberculosis, and the family said, you got to get out of the city. That's going to be the only place to cure you, is to get you out of the city. So they got Arthur on the train. They sent him up to Lac La Belle, and he stayed with family in the small house on the lake. Let's see here. So Simone died, and then Arthur died on September 23rd. So within months of each other, the baby died, and then Arthur died. Lydia had come to a difficult decision. Harmon, now 5, and his brother Arthur, 7, were placed in the orphanage while Lydia tried to reclaim her life. Lydia was 28, and she was restarting her life nearly from the same position she found herself in 1903. The city directories of 1914 and 1915 list Widow Gothier living at 187 Perkins, which was a short walk to several mills. She was alone again in Lowell. And I often wondered why she put the boys up into the orphanage at Franco-American. And they had a day program. So at first I thought maybe she was able just to leave them there for the day and she could come home and bring them home. She lived in women's quarters for the mills. The mills there was 2 types of housing in Lowell at the time. You could live in some of the regular apartments, which were owned by some mill owners and some that weren't owned by mill owners, or you could live in mill properties and they were called the mill girls who lived in those properties. And she was living in one of the mill girl properties. And the mill girl properties, you couldn't have kids living there. So the kids were in the orphanage. So why didn't she have them living with Arthur's parents on Sarah Avenue? I don't think she got along very well with her mother-in-law. My great-grandmother Elizabeth was a strong figure, a no-nonsense Victorian woman, and it would be her way, and that was the end of it. And I don't know that Lydia was willing to put up with that because she was young and determined to make it on her own. A lot of that's conjecture and family history. But the fact that the boys weren't with their grandmother kind of reinforces that. Let's see here. So they were brought there. Some of the children were temporary residents and others permanent. In 1911, the grotto of Our Lady of Lourdes was built at behind the orphanage. It was a scaled replica of the original one in France. Also, a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary, imported from France, was placed in the niche in the grotto. In October of 1912, 14 stations of the Way of the Cross are placed in the spacious grounds leading to the grotto. While there, Arthur and Armand saw a 4-story brick addition built to the back of the orphanage. The children moved into the spacious area on February 19, 1913, and the very next day, Mass was celebrated in the new chapel dedicated to the Sacred Heart. The solemn benediction of the new orphanage took place on June 21st, 1913, and the French community, hundreds in fact, would come to the school on July 2nd, 1911 for the annual celebration of America's independence, complete with pageants, games, and speeches. It was also a good time for family to visit the children. And I found out about the records of my grandfather being there through online records that the orphanage has. It's amazing to see your grandfather's name in an orphanage. The mayor of Lowell, this is a quote from the Boston Globe. The mayor of Lowell and the members of the Lowell City Government and Lowell Board of Health will be requested to appear before the Special Committee of the House on Tuberculosis next Tuesday afternoon, who explain why that city has failed to comply with the state law regarding the building of tuberculosis hospitals, reported the Boston Globe on July 17, 1913. The article states that the city was being brought forward due to, quote, flagrant disobedience of the State Board of Health. The state was making an example of Lowell because it did not follow the law requiring the establishment of a separate hospital for the care of TB patients. Mayor O'Donnell said the city officials had thought that there might be a change in the law requiring such hospitals, and the city preferred to pay the expense of sending the patients to the state hospital, which was in Tewksbury. I guess my great-grandmother had been in touch with some of her relatives, and she, on August 21st, 1916, Lydia Rowe married Edward Bourgeois in the Diocese of Three Rivers in Saint-Angel-de-Laval. That's where my family had originally come from before they moved to Montcalm. Widow Gothy was trying again. She had lost 2 daughters. She had lost her husband. She was returning to her roots with her 2 sons to start anew. Some other good things happened that year. Lowell St. Jean Baptiste Church, which had been destroyed in a fire in 1912, was rebuilt and began having masses. Three Rivers population, 18,445 in 1911, had been devastated by fire in 1908 that burned through the business district, but was rebuilding a modern city, a short commute by ferry over the St. Lawrence from St. Angel. Let's see, St. Angel was founded in 1868. The population of the town at the last census in 1911 was 687. So that was a very big change. I mean, 687, that was much smaller even than Pawtucketville section of Lowell. So Lydia had been living in the boarding homes with 40 to 60 other women in Lowell and working in factories with nearly as many people as the entire town. But here her sons could grow up in the way the Rowe family had before. They would learn farming and could enjoy the river and attend small schools run by the nuns. Here there would be fewer challenges with other ethnic groups as they were in Lowell, and they were closer to nature. Any hopes that Lydia had of those dreams coming true soon ended. My great-grandmother, Lydia Rowe Bourgeois, was buried on November 30th, 1917, in the village of Saint-Angel-de-Laval. The daughter of Pierre and Delphine Rowe had lived only 32 years. Those attending the burial included her sons, her husband, Rowe family members, and Duchamp family members as well. Her sons, Arthur, now 12, and Armand, 10, signed the church records of their mother's death and burial, posed for a photo with their stepfather after the services were completed. And then Edward Bourgeois informed them that their time together had come to an end. He recommended that they should seek out their family to raise them, as he would not. And I'll come back to Edward Bourgeois. I've got a picture. Oh, here it is. So here's the picture of, there's Edward Bourgeois, and there's Edward Bourgeois sitting, and there's Armand Gauthier, my grandfather, and his brother Arthur, with Edward posing after my great-grandmother was buried. She died of pneumonia. All that work, and she died from pneumonia. And I only found that out from family history because the priests were very good at keeping track of who was baptized, who was married, and who was buried. They were less concerned about how they died. So you don't see a lot of how they died. You have to try to piece that together as best you can. The Gauthiers all had moved to Lowell from Drummondville, and so Lydia's orphan sons, Arthur and Armand, went to find their mother's Rowe family 2 towns away across the river in Montcalm. And I got this from family's history. They walked across the frozen St. Lawrence River. Normally, they could have taken the ferry Glacier, which ran even in winter if the water did not freeze. In December 1917, the river froze, and the boys crossed the 3 miles wearing the homemade moccasins that Lydia had made. They found Lydia's family and stayed with them a short time, but there were already too many mouths to feed there. And so, for the second time in their young lives, Arthur and Armand were placed in an orphanage. The Rowes were not unkind people. If they had been able to, they would have kept both the boys, but the nuns at the orphanage in Three Rivers could guarantee shelter and food for them. This was a guarantee the Rowes could simply not match. Ultimately, the Gauthiers learned what had happened and sent for Arthur and Armand. They took the train, so Hercule and Elizabeth eventually heard what happened, and they took the train from Three Rivers and were returned to Lowell. The 1920 census lists Arthur, 14, and Armand, 12, living at 24 Sarah Ave in Lowell, along with grandparents Hercule, 66, Elizabeth, 62, aunts Diana, 36, and Loretta, 20. Angelina had joined the convent by then, and Yvonne married Eusebe Lemire in 1917 and were living in Franklin, New Hampshire. Hercule was still working as a foundry man. A month after the census was taken, the Gauthiers and the Gagneys were joined with their marriage of Loretta and Ernest J. Gagney on May 31st at St. Jean-Baptiste Church. Witnesses were Pierre Gagney, Hercule Gauthier, as it appears in the marriage register. The newlyweds lived at 24 Sarah Ave. Why buy a place when you can live with mom and dad? And the brothers who had buried both parents, buried 2 sisters, and lived in 2 orphanages, now had 2 father figures and 3 mother figures as they grew up in Lowell. And so here's another picture of Lydia before she passed. And here is a picture of the cemetery at Saint Angel de Laval that my wife and I got to visit. Unless you had a lot of money, you didn't have a headstone because they would have had to have shipped in the stones for that, and it cost a lot more than putting together a wooden cross with your name on it. Wooden crosses tend to deteriorate over time, and so I'm not exactly sure where Lydia is buried in this cemetery, but we went to visit her, didn't we, honey? And I point that out because my grandfather, Armand, when he got married in 1934, he went on he took a trip with his wife for their honeymoon one of the places they stopped was Saint-Angel de Laval, so he could introduce his wife to his mother. That's that one. Now, we mentioned Lac La Belle, north of Montreal, and how Arthur had gone there, and how baby Claire had died there, and the family had taken them in as their own. So 2 years ago, my wife and I, went to Lac La Belle, and we connected with family that we had not been connected with for 110 years.
Wow.
The reason that we were able to connect with them is first ancestry. I got the list of the names of who and what and who, Joseph's sons and daughters, and then their sons and daughters. And then I compared that with people from Lac La Belle who have the same last name. And I was able to connect with who's not in the picture. But Franz, yeah, she's not there in the picture, but Franz was taking the picture. She's my cousin. She's the great-granddaughter of Joseph Teddo, who was the brother of Elizabeth Teddo, my second great-grandmother. And so I got to meet these are the children of Joseph, the grandchildren of Joseph Teddo, great-grandchildren. And it was very nice. We had a very nice day. We got to tour the original house. We got to see the original barn, which is now a rentable Airbnb kind of thing. And we got to see the lake and the place that they had given up for all the city life of Lowell and Franklin, New Hampshire, to abandon all that and go up in the middle of nowhere, essentially, because this was very much nowhere at the time. And I always wondered, why did they do that? Because they were giving away land grants to try to entice the French to come back. They wanted the French to come back from the United States, and so they gave free land if you stay for 10 years. And you had to work the land and grow a farm and have your family, and all these people would be back in the Catholic Church up there rather than down there where sin and electricity prevail.
No.
So I'll pass that around too. Thank you. See if I missed anything out of here. So, I mean, they were so nice, though. They had known about the Lowell side of the family, but never really had connected. And my mother had been to La Belle, but she didn't know any of these people and had no way of really connecting to them. So she never stopped to visit anything or visit anybody. She had just made a pilgrimage to get up there to say, I've been up there. And so they went up there. But they were so nice. They opened up their home, showed us all their stuff, showed us how they put together their family trees, and little language barrier because it was mostly French spoken. I can do comme ci, comme ça, and tout. But fortunately, there was a relative there who could speak some English, and while he hung around, we were able to do a lot of conversing. And when he had to leave early, we conversed as best we could, but we made ourselves known to each other. And I'm still in touch with them all now. I send the Christmas cards. They send me Christmas cards. I send them pictures. They send me pictures. It's very nice. And at some point, we'll get back up there. So this is a picture of Lydia and Arthur and Armand after Arthur Sr. passed away from tuberculosis. I don't know why, but it seemed to have been the thing that when somebody dies, you take a picture. Yeah. Take a picture. One of my relatives had a picture of their son in a casket. So I think that might be going a bit far. That's that. There's a picture after Lydia died of pneumonia. And there he is, Edward Bourgeois. And there's my grandfather, Armin, and there's Arthur, his brother. And I'll tell you a quick little story about Edward Bourgeois. Edward Bourgeois died in 1971. And the reason I know that is because my grandfather had kept in touch with him. You would think that he would not want to keep in touch with this guy who didn't want him.
Right.
My grandfather, continued to correspond with him periodically, and my grandmother wanted nothing to do with him. But my Pepe, he didn't think ill of anybody. He treated him kindly, kinder than Edward ever treated the boys. That's for sure.
Did Edward ever remarry?
Yeah, he did, of course. Yeah, yeah. And that's not uncommon. I mean, most of the when somebody dies, it's pretty quick that they got remarried, especially with the bigger the families that they had. Edward didn't have a family, and so I'm sure he was looking to start one of his own. The two kids of his wife, was not as impressive to him as starting his own. Sure, but back then it was very common to get married very quickly after somebody one of your spouses passed. They had to take care of all these kids. Let's see here. Okay, we did all that. So then he's back here in Lowell. And when he was a young man, my grandfather didn't work the mills, but he would deliver lunch pails and buckets of beer to the mill workers in Lowell. And he would do that because the mill workers, the whistle would blow, all the work, the mills would shut down, all the workers would go out. They didn't have enough time to go leave the place. And so kids would bring their lunch pails. And they didn't have refrigerators back then. Kids would bring the lunch pails and they'd bring a bucket of beer and they would get a quarter or a nickel or something like that for doing their troubles. And here's my grandfather as a young man in the 20s. Got it colorized later. I had somebody colorize it for me, got it hanging on my wall. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you this. So I pointed this out earlier. So this is those stories. I've read you a couple of those stories so far. And what I do is I put them in here, and you notice the headline has a date on it. And I got smart after a little while. I started adding the date to the top. So that way it'd be easier to put it in the book, where it would go into the history. I got even smarter this year because I figured out that when I write this up, I can put in a page number because relatives were complaining that the pages would get mixed up. And so I set up page numbers now for it. The reason I use a 3-ring binder is because I make mistakes or I find out something new or somebody finds a correction that I need to make, and I can just simply take out the page and put in a new one in its place. I find it's easier that way for me. I'm sure at some point my mother would love if I put all the Gothiers in a bound edition, for example, or all the 40 years or whatnot. But for now, this works. And if you'd like to look at it, I can pass that around. In there, I not only have the family stories, but I also I got a map of St. Joseph's Cemetery, where many of my relatives are buried, and I pestered the people who work at St. Joseph's Cemetery to tell me who's buried in each plot. And they have cards at the cemeteries of when they died, when they're buried, and who's buried in each plot, and that sort of thing. And it helps to round out a lot of the details if you don't already have those. But I use the map that they provided so that we can go back and visit all the relatives at St. Joseph's, and I pass that around to the family members as well. I don't know if any of my go ahead.
Sure. There's somebody on Zoom that would like to see that book before you go too far.
Yep.
He wanted to know if you were going to scan it.
Oh, see, this is the 3-ring binder. This is St. Joseph's Cemetery. And then this is the piece, our French relatives, ancestors. My mother wrote that piece, and so it will always be the first part of the book.
So basically you have the pages in that you just showed us.
Right. Yeah.
Thanks.
And each
Microphone doesn't like that.
So each of the, oh, did I lose the microphone?
Yeah.
I did. So, I mean, with the 3-ring binder, I can just add new chapters to it. And it makes it easier for me just to work with it that way. You know, I don't know if that'd work for everybody. I don't know that I've ever really seen how other people do it, but it works for me. It's easy.
Thank you. You can pass it around now.
Okay.
Sorry, Jim and Sandy.
Okay. So 1934 rolls around and happy days. Happy days have come. So there's my grandfather, Armand Gauthier, his brother Arthur. That's my grandmother, Aurea Fortier, and her brother, Edward. And that was September 3rd, 1934. And you think you learn everything you know or can know. I mean, I know that during the Great Depression was a kind of a weird time to get married, but when you're young and in love, that's what you do. But interesting thing, you talk to your relatives and you learn things each time you talk to them. My mother told me that during the Depression, my grandfather had been saving up money to buy a house. And when the banks closed, he lost $2,000 he had saved up because it was just gone. There was no federal insurance protection back then. It was just gone. Fortunately, his aunt Dinah, or Diana, who he lived with on Sarah Ave, she became a spinster, never left the house, never had kids of her own, always worked. She loaned him the money. So he was able to buy the house on Phoebe Avenue that I was able to visit as a kid growing up on many, many occasions. But I didn't know that until just recently.
Did she not trust banks, or did she have cash?
Yeah, probably. You know. Yeah. Let's see here.
She had
The house.
a place underneath the mattress.
That's right. You know, you learn so many things, like the house on Sarah Avenue. I had been there when I was a kid. Then the university bought it and knocked it down for parking or whatever. I didn't think it was anything, special about a house. But my mother reminded me that her grandmother Elizabeth had gotten a Tiffany chandelier for that house. Like, it's a 4-bedroom house. I mean, they had a Tiffany chandelier. Okay. But Elizabeth and Hercule had gotten involved in real estate in Lowell. And Pawtucketville, as I mentioned earlier, was the place where the French community developed. And the Gauthiers were part of the people that built some of those houses. And they didn't stay in real estate for long, but there was enough to be able to give them their house. And also a place where Elizabeth could put relatives who, what did she? Oh, the cripple house. And I say that because that's Elizabeth's words. It's not, not a pejorative or anything, but that's, if a relative couldn't handle things on their own for a short period of time or a long period of time, they went to that house. That's where they stayed. Yes.
You know what happened to
I don't know what happened to the Tiffany chandelier. I don't. I have a suspicion that after Elizabeth passed, it ended up with a cousin somewhere. And I know that my mother's cousin who lived there ended up throwing a lot of stuff away because she didn't know who they were in the pictures and whatnot. It drives my mother crazy. Drives my mother crazy. Don't bring that up if you see my mother. So here's this. How much time have I got? Am I doing okay in time?
You're in the negative, so keep.
Oh, I'm in the
So
negative.
keep talking.
Oh, okay. All right, so
If you
Armin,
want to go ahead.
okay. Armin Gauthier married Aurea Fortier on September 3rd, 1934. The morning had arrived with the 6:10 a.m. sunrise. It was a fair and sunny with temperature a few degrees below 70. The Lowell Sun reported on the local part of a nationwide strike of textile workers set to begin tomorrow. Thousands of workers from the Boot Mills, Nashua Mills, Talbot Mills, Lawrence Manufacturing, Merrimack Manufacturing, and others would take to the streets of the city on Tuesday in answer to the strike call. Armin wasn't in a union, but knew a lot of people who were, and knew from having lived in the city for most of his life that trouble followed strikes. The Boston Globe reported that union bosses predicted that such a strike, quote, would bring the New England mills to a standstill, unquote. Mill owners counted that the mills would be open, quote, for all who chose to work, unquote. Police were prepared to keep the two sides apart. The unions were planning a mass gathering on the South Common for noon that day. The paper also reported that local boys had their own protest, but for a very different reason. They were upset summer was coming to an end and they would be forced to return to school. A dozen or more boys armed with scrap iron and rocks broke nearly 30 windows at the Varnum Junior High School in Centerville. It was Labor Day, and there'd be a swim competitions on the Merrimack River, children's track meet at O'Donnell Playground, a tennis tournament at Highland Park, golf tournament at Vesper Country Club, marathon from Lawrence to Lowell, and fireworks that night at Butler Athletic Club Carnival at Washington Park. The Strand Theater had just reopened over the weekend after being closed for renovations, and with Will Rogers starring in Andy as the reopening feature show. Armin Gauthier was less interested in the dramatic actions taking place in Lowell or in the antics of juvenile delinquents or in the various Labor Day festivities or what star would grace the screen at the Strand than in what this day held in store for him personally. Monday, September 3rd, 1934 was the day he would wed Aurea Fortier. He was 27 years old and drove a truck delivering furniture. He also worked in various capacities for Leo Kerouac, father of future writer Jack Kerouac. The Kerouacs lived. Okay. I'm going to skip a part of that stuff because we talked about some of this. And there's a lot of quotes in there from other stuff. But it's all about the day they got married. And I was able to find the information about the day they got married from, you start with the church record, you start with the information from the Lowell Sun about the weather, what was happening in the news that day, and you put it all together to kind of give a semblance of what the life was like at that particular moment. I can never go back to experience 1934 myself, but because of these different tools that I picked up in my researching, I could put together what some of those things that I know for a fact he experienced while that day was happening. So a successful wedding, because this is 25 years later. There's Armin, now losing more hair there. And there's Aurea. That's my mom, right there. That's her. And Lorraine, that's his brother Arthur. That's his son Arthur. Jean, and that's Arthur's wife. And that's Edward, who was in the wedding picture. And that's John, who's still with us, and several of them are still with us.
Wow.
The siblings have breakfast every Sunday.
That's nice.
And I get to see them, and I aggravate them for stories and quotes, and I get them talking. Some of them are more interested in talking than others. My Aunt Jean, she loves to talk. My Uncle John could care less about any of this stuff.
Did they start arguing between each other?
Oh yeah, I love it.
What really happened?
Yeah, I love it. When they start talking, they bring up fights that happened 50, 60 years ago, you know, and it's all gold to me. So I keep them talking. When you're working on stories, this, you know, I used to write 10 pages or whatnot. Now I try to keep them to like 4 or 6. And I put in a lot more pictures and bigger pictures because I think the audience is more interested in that. But there's different types of stories, man versus man. And those are, for us doing family history, you're going to see a lot of that with war stories. And you can get records on your relatives from the National Personnel Record Center. You can get those for free. They'll give you write in to them. And if you want, you can contact Senator Collins' office. I'll help you with that. But they'll send you whatever records they have on them. And you can even get a copy of any medals that your relative might have earned while they were in the service. And they'll do that free of charge. Then for some reason, the National Personnel Record Center does all this stuff free of charge. You go to the Department of State to get records on immigration. It costs an arm and a leg. And the records aren't that good for what you get. That was my experience. But the National Personnel Record Center, it's great.
Personnel or personal?
Personnel.
Okay.
Yeah. There's also man versus nature, which you have lots of because of diseases, storms, fires, all that stuff. And man versus self, those are harder to do because you don't know what your relative was in their head unless they had a diary. And God bless you, if you had a diary, you're better than I am, because I can't get anything like that. I start with a timeline. I put together a timeline of events, first when they were born and move all the way through their life and all the different things that they did. And then I plug in events that were happening around them at the time into the timeline. So if there was a fire in the town, I plug that into the timeline. If there was the church burned down, if there was something else that happened, I plug all that in because I like to get a rounded picture of what was happening to shape who they are.
More of a story than just facts.
Right, exactly.
More interesting.
Yeah, and it makes them more of a full person. You'll never get to the point of knowing who they were completely because they're long gone. But I feel I'm doing them justice by trying to figure out who they were and what challenges they overcame. And then you build your story with the most interesting fact as the lead paragraph. If they overcame something, that's got to be the lead. And then you build to that point all the way through your story. And so here is the last piece. And this is, I won't read it all to you because you can go online and find this for yourself because Jack Kerouac's In the Ring, a tribute to Aaron Gauthier, published March 1968 in the Atlantic magazine. My grandfather in the Atlantic magazine. He didn't use his name. He called him Roland Boutelier, but it's really Aaron Gauthier. And in here, it's an interesting story where Leo would fix the fights. I know you'd be shocked, huh? Shocked that fights were fixed, but fights were fixed. And my Pepe was supposed to take a fall, and the guy that he was wrestling spit in his face. That made my grandfather angry, and he won the fight. And Leo got mad at him. Why did you do that, Armin? Shouldn't have ought to spit in my face like that, Leo. So it was interesting. And some of the things tie together nicely because in the stories that Kerouac, he talks about the trips that he would go on with his parents. They would go to New York City. They would go to Montreal. And I get these postcards that I found from my grandfather to my grandmother about his trip to New York with the Kerouacs and how they visited Grant's tomb. And then I found a picture more recently, maybe the last decade or so, we found pictures of my grandfather when he was a young man. Right around that age, he worked with dumbbells there. And I won't read you the whole thing. Yeah, there he is holding up the two guys.
Well,
So I'll pass that around.
That's good.
So that's them at their 50th wedding anniversary.
Um,
So some sources for records, Ancestry, of course, is a great place. Your town offices, state archives, newspapers, National Personnel Records Center. Those are all good sources. Historic societies are wonderful, and I applaud the Winthrop Historic Society for what they're doing, keeping the past alive. And I want you to know that for my Eagle Scout project, I couldn't have cared less about history at the time, but my Eagle Scout project was the Drake Historic Society. I helped them with doing work over there to make it an even better place. So this is them at their 50th wedding anniversary in 1984. Another picture of them from 1984. And I'm going to leave you with this. Find the good. Okay? Our ancestors deserve that. Find the honest. If it doesn't fit right, don't try to force it to make it fit right. Do no harm. My mother has forbidden me to write about certain things. So her uncle served, her uncle Fortier, Alfred Fortier, he went by several different names, but he served in World War I, and he was on a howitzer line over in France, and they didn't have air protectors or anything like that. And the howitzer line, their job was just to blow the hell out of the enemy and move forward as fast as they could. And so the guns were always going boom, boom, boom all day long. And so he got a little daffy from it. And when he got back to Lowell, he was working for the munitions company. And after the war ended, guess what? Munitions companies didn't need people to work at the munitions company because there's no war. So he was out of work and daffy. And there was no VA to take care of veterans at the time. And so him and a couple buddies decided that they were going to do something smart. Stupid. They held up a haberdasher in Lowell. And the haberdasher didn't take kindly to having these young punks rob him. And so my great uncle pulled out a gun and he shot the guy. And word spread very quickly that they had shot the guy, and a mob formed to chase down my uncle. And a police cop saved him from getting lynched from the mob. But he ended up going to jail. My great grandmother on the Fortier side, who could barely speak any English. Now, mind you, in Pawtucketville, Lowell, you did not need to speak English because everybody spoke French. You could speak. You could go to the store and speak French. You go, everything. And if anybody started to talk English, just walk away. Well, she had to go to Boston to testify on her son's behalf. And here she is, this little old lady from St. Ubald, Canada, come to Lowell, got married here, had kids here. One of the kids ends up killing somebody. And she had to say in French that insanity ran on both sides of the family as a way to try to get her son off him. It didn't work. He spent 20 years in Charles Street prison. And then he came out and he was fine after that. Straightened up in jail, but that's a story that will never be written. Mom has forbidden me from writing. She liked her uncle, Alfred. He was an interesting character. He had worked for the other newspaper in Lowell, the Courier, and a piece of metal from the typesetting machine had popped off and hit him in the eye, and he lost one eye. And so one time my mother and her siblings were snooping around his bedroom, and they came upon his eye in there. But he was a character. I met him when I was young. He died in 1973, I think. So that's about all of my formal presentation, but if you guys have questions, I'd be glad to answer some about what I've done. I know I talked your ear off and whatnot, and I apologize for that.
Feel free to ask questions, raise your hand, or
Yeah.
get up and go home.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make a comment real quick. When you had commented on headstones and everything, it's so true that we don't appreciate what's in the cemetery, because I know that the Cobb family, my family, has a headstone that my great grandmother had purchased to be in the cemetery on Turkey Lane. And I had found the receipt at one point, and this was in the 1880s, and it was $800.
Wow.
That's like a ridiculous amount of money.
Yeah.
And our family is thankful that it exists. And with my grandfather's passing and my grandmother's passing, they were the last one, and then Bud and Red, that could be part of the carving on the headstone. But it is so true that we don't realize how precious that simple piece of information can be for everybody.
And as far as Armin Gothier goes, his story is not completely done. I have purposefully not written how he passed. I don't know why I haven't. Maybe I don't feel like he's dead if I don't write that part.
It's a
So-
page it's a book you don't want to close yet.
Right. Yeah, I'm not done with him yet.
Yeah.
So as long as I don't write that, I guess it'll go. But it doesn't mean that I can't do him on it by tracking down more of his ancestors. I know he was extremely proud of the Gothiers and the Rose and the Duchamps. And I mean, because of him, I have found Acadian relatives. I have found relatives who've gone off to the gold rush. Well, I haven't found him yet. He's still missing, but I'll find him.
It's still golden.
I'll find, I find all kinds of surprises. Right now, I'm working on a piece about my relatives who died in Quebec City in 1832 when the cholera epidemic happened. And, you can follow the newspaper articles day by day and the Board of Health reports, and it matches up with, when my fourth or fifth great grandmother died, during the summer of 1832. And so, I don't know for a fact that she's a cholera victim. I suspect she was, because there's no death certificate and the priest didn't list cholera, but they did set up a specific cemetery just for the cholera victims. So odds are she was one of the cholera victims because she died in that summer. And there's lots of surprises your relatives, your ancestors will give you. You just have to go looking for it.
Thank you so much, Chuck.
Thank you.
Awesome.
All.